Our second speaker in this session is Alan Oxley. Alan's the principal of IGS Global, a company that's an organisation that's had deep and extensive experience in trade and negotiations over the last 25 years. Alan has extensive experience advising government and the private sector on strategy and corporate affairs, managing multidisciplinary projects on trade and economic policy, and delivering capacity building programs for developing countries in the Asia Pacific. So our second speaker, please welcome Alan Oxley.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Last time I spoke at one of these events, you sent a signal afterwards, I thought, when you sent the instructions through, because it said if you're going to do any PowerPoints, keep them simple and plain, don't load them with lots of stuff. And I, of course, presented PowerPoints that nobody could read. Endless numbers and stats and what have you. So this time I've really got just simple ones, because it's the best way to do it. It's countries forget their history at their cost. And I want to show you some quite interesting numbers. About 3 years ago, a British journalist, he was with the BBC, wrote a book after he left Australia. He went to New York, I think. And his book began with a sentence which started something like, The Economist magazine 2 years ago reported that Australia had the highest continuous rate of growth for 26 years. Only one other Western country had a longer period of continuous growth. That was the Netherlands, but it wasn't by much more. He said this country's had a spectacular record. The Economist magazine about 3 years ago, the cover sheet had said, this is the new California. And the interesting thing, he then went to say, I should say, and finish though, he said that this country has, in the last 5 years, had 8 changes of leadership, all the major parties. What's the matter with it? Pretty fair question, I thought. We still, I think, are entitled to ask that question about our political system. But more importantly, was this observation about the 26 years of growth. I want to show you some numbers which I think tell us everything and what in fact led to the beginning of this period of growth. In today's dollars, in 1980, a Holden Commodore cost $80,000. Today a Holden Commodore costs $43,000. Now, they're notional dollars, but that means that today's consumers have a lot more money available to spend on education, investment, looking after their children, than they did when the only cars they could buy were heavily protected at such a high price. Now you can complain about the fact that our motor industry has to have to go offshore, but at some point the cost to the community of supporting these over-expensive cars and the denial to consumers of a practical use of their money, which enables them to get better wealth, tells its own story. And that is the reason for the success of Australia for the last 26 years. We still are one of the best growing countries in the world, despite how bad things are and flat. Now, for me, the issue is competitiveness. And while Bob has given us several instances of things that he considers to be unhappy developments in the agricultural sector, sitting at the back of all of these issues is, are our consumers, are our producers competitive or not? If they're not competitive, you can't compete in global markets and you can't get the return. We've got a long, dismal history of involvement, not just in manufacturing, but in agriculture, now most of it's past, which has actually been at our considerable cost. Now, I think the focus today, though, is we've asked to consider 2 questions which you sent to us in the brief. Is talk of reversion to protectionism going to hold opening of new markets for agricultural products? This is meant to be what we call the Trump question. And is there some scope in WTO to remove restrictions of agricultural imports? These are 2 questions that you sent to us, Chairman, to ask us to address. So I will put my comments into the frame of these. To me, the short answers for the first one is uncertain. And I'll come back to the TPP and what Trump's had to say about that. And for the second one, is there scope in WTO to remove restrictions of agricultural imports? I say no. But unfortunately, the WTO, which I spent quite a bit of time being involved with, unfortunately, is stuck with jam. It's one of the reasons why we're getting more progress in bilateral and regional free trade agreements, and the the WTO itself. One of the key reasons is the incapacity, disinterest, inability of the United States, the European Community, India, and larger developing countries to want to consider further reduction of trade barriers at all. So worldwide we have a picture where average tariffs on industrial products are quite low, almost insignificant when you take currency fluctuations into account. Where we do have higher tariffs and control is in agriculture. Fortunately for us, we're getting finally some traction. We're able to get access to markets through the agricultural products through these free trade agreements in a way which we've never been able to achieve through the multilateral processes. It's a sad, sad reality. Now, let's go to the heart of the question, the first one, which is really, what is Donald Trump up to? And he's really put three broad positions. I should mention one thing. US politics is quite confusing. My first visit to the United States was in the 70s, when I had a job in foreign affairs at the United Nations. Most of my time was spent with UNRI. It frankly would have been better spent on trying to understand US politics. I ended up very sceptical about the United Nations. Everything that's inside that organisation has got a downside, really not worth pursuing. But I was completely confused about US politics. I tried to have some sort of understanding about how to work to no avail. Many years later, in our consultancy work, we did, and we still work with a Washington DC firm, and working with them, they were basically Republican. I've gradually got some sort of dim understanding of how US politics works, and it is completely different to ours. The first amazing thing about US politics is how little power governors and presidents have. It's their legislatures which pass the laws and regulations, and if you look at the case of California, the most ridiculous laws get passed, costs are ignored. It's no wonder in parts of the United States the parts of the system simply are ineffective and ungovernable. This is the reality. The other thing which is striking is fact and truth doesn't seem to carry much in US politics. I've always been amazed at what, in fact we've seen it with the two contenders for the presidential campaign. The details of what both of them have been up to over time are quite staggering, and yet it just doesn't seem to count in the electorate of much, except one interesting thing about this election, that the turnout was much lower than in previous elections. While Trump won, his vote was far below some of the Republicans who got beaten in the elections. So he tapped a really sore wound in the social fabric of the United States, and Hillary plainly generated quite a degree of distaste for her style and probably more as a function of her connection with her husband. When you read the literature of what's been published about what they've done and not done, it's gobsmacking. It makes our politicians look like people who would never tell a fib. US politics is difficult to understand. With that, therefore, one has to be quite careful in assessing the prognostications and statements that are made by politicians. And that's the sense in which I've looked at what the Trump was supposed to be offering us. So what are the key trade positions of concern to us that Trump's put on the table? The first one is that he says they're going to restrict the imports of manufacturers from China. Bob touched on some of this. It's very easy to misrepresent the relationship between China and the United States, but some of the things about how China proceeds are actually symbolic of a very organised and planned and deliberate system of government. At the time when China applied to join the WTO, I always worried that they would actually possibly destroy the system, because they didn't have rule of law in the same way that we did. You can't participate in WTO unless you accept the system, unless you accept an external adjudication about whether or not you comply with the laws and rules. And at the time I was concerned because China was such a big trader that if it joined the system with its trade weight, that might have pulled it apart. I was wrong. China turned out to be an exemplary member of the WTO, unlike India. The reality is that India doesn't trade much. So the Indians block anything that they might consider against their interests, where China is a huge trader, and China has accepted the disciplines and rules. So if someone complains that China has failed to do this or follow that measure, and if China objects to it and refuses to change, there's a compulsory dispute settlement system, which is very significantly underrated. We talk a lot about the WTO losing its steam. The WTO is possibly the only significant body of black-letter international law. All the members of the WTO have accepted binding commitments to go through a process of adjudication if a member complains that rights under the agreement have not been met in the trading arrangement. And at the time when China joined, the big concern is that China might not comply. For a long time, the United States Congress refused, before the WTO was formed, the US Congress would not allow the administration to accept these laws and rules, but in fact, in practice, the administration did. So it's easily said, well, I withdraw from WTO. He won't, because when Trump gets a proper briefing on the rights that accord to the United States to trade with other countries, he will not in a hurry slip away from that. Because if the moment he does that, the United States will be liable to being sued by all its other major trading partners if they want it. And there's another factor here. Major economies don't deal with these trade rights frivolously. They don't necessarily take action at any point in time. They'll weigh up as to whether they should or they shouldn't. But there is a broad commitment to keeping this open market system operational, and it has actually been extremely successful. It is, in my opinion, probably the only successful set of international arrangement we have, and it's been very important for underpinning the very significant rates of growth and rises in living standards that occurred. It was one of the bedrocks for building the new Europe after the Second World War, and the establishment of the GATT and the rules around that were part of that process. So, what would be the gripe that Trump has about China? It'll be steel. One thing that appeared in the media, the primary advisor on trade to Trump is a guy who is the CEO of Nucor. Nucor's the biggest steel manufacturing business in the United States. It doesn't have blast furnaces, it uses arc furnaces, and he will be pressing to have action against cheaper Chinese steel. There's a long disputation about that, and my view is that that'll be the area which this will be settled. The United States will not take on China at large. There's several reasons for this. One is the extremely large holdings of dollars that the Chinese have. There were big investments in the US as part of their balancing. And the Chinese and the Americans, for the last 10 years, have had a very sophisticated understanding in dealing with each other on exchange rates. There's been lots of talk about taking action, retaliating. Both, however, have been fully conscious if they let that get out of control, there'll be cataclysmic impacts on the world financial system. That's very significant. So the Chinese, my guess is the Chinese, if Trump said, we want you to do something about steel, you're dumping the product, we want you to put rules on, there are ways in which Chinese could say, right, I can go along with that. The question in my mind is, what will they ask in return? They might actually say to the Americans, yeah, that's okay, we'll do that. By the way, we want your ships to go no nearer than 100 metres, 100 miles, 100 kilometres from the south, what's the area, the south.
South China Sea.
Thank you, South China Sea. That's the way that issue will be dealt with. And once that's addressed, it'll be business as usual, because the business and trade relationship between China and the United States is large and deep. These things aren't dealt with lightly. The second one that Trump's got in mind is Mexico. He says the Mexicans are taking our jobs, we'll tear up the North American Free Trade Agreement. The sort of relationship, big powers have got more sway than smaller powers. A typical result of this will be the Mexicans will say, all right, well, we'll make some adjustments here, what do you want? There's no need to tear up the NAFTA agreement, which incidentally has been extremely successful. The NAFTA agreement was the vehicle which allowed the United States to transfer a lot of its lower cost manufacturing to Mexico. That caused living standards to rise in Mexico. It made the American motor manufacturing industry more competitive. And it's not different to the way in which the Germans in fact shipped a lot of their motor manufacturing to the lower income economies in Eastern Europe. That's the pattern of the way the industry works. I can't think of a way, frankly, how Trump can think he can get those jobs back by, what's he going to do? Put 100% tariff on imports of cars, raise the cost of the car to American consumers. I don't think so. My guess is he was probably going to generate jobs in infrastructure and create the jobs there. So it's a very political play. He was pitching to the dissatisfied workers, the white workers, who have been excluded from overtime from jobs simply because, for whatever reason, the United States haven't had the skills to replace the ones that they had when they were working as lower cost contributors to manufacturing. A word on manufacturing generally. Globally now, among the industrialised countries, it is not a major employer. Automation has had a big impact. In Australia, we've seen the same thing, and it's the same thing in the rest of the world. So it's just a reality about how some of these industries are developing. That'll be my view on that, and if Mexico agrees to a deal, which they probably will, because after all, the United States is the bigger neighbour, smaller countries don't sort of push them around, that I would expect might be the end of the discussion, saying we'll pull NAFTA apart. The Canadians wouldn't want that either. Now, he's also said he's opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yes, technically so is Hillary, although in fact Hillary's initiative, largely with the President, was to create this pivot, as called in Asia, part of the agreements. I think our leaders have been a bit inept in some of the initial comments they've made following the election campaign. First of all, with American systems, you have to wait to sit for time before you can actually see where cars are going to fall and what's going to run. And on this trade stuff, while it's been carried around, it is actually, in the US political order of things, about 10th or 12th order. Much of it has been designed to build a political case for Trump. And what I think I heard Julie Bishop saying at one point, oh, well, you know, we need to lobby the Americans to make sure they go to this TPP agreement. That was a mistake. She should have said nothing. Absolutely nothing should have been said, and should have let us roll through that. On the TPP, there are significant American interests in this. Trump campaigned against it because it suited his political case. But in fact, the United States has got a lot to win out of this agreement. And I thought the most interesting thing recently that I saw was that Mitch McConnell, who's the head of the Republicans in the Senate, stated that maybe at the end of the year we could revisit the TPP agreement. When Congress decided to put a process in place where this agreement could be reviewed and adopted, in fact the timeline for that is 2 years. So the TPP will be lying around in Congress could be lying around in Congress for 2 years, and I would still be prepared to put money on the fact that we'll bring it to life at some point. TPP offers some valuable additional agricultural access in some of the areas. It's a bit slower off the frame. The agricultural access we're getting, the bilateral free trade agreements with China, Korea and Japan is actually more significant. In some ways makes up for us a bit what we failed to get, or not a bit, a lot, out of the WTO. And Trump said he'll leave the WTO if necessary. That's just a bluster. The loss of interest in the US in doing that was way, way, way exceed. As I said before, it's important to remember that executives in the United States system, presidents, don't have that much power. At the end of the day, it's a Congress. This is a Republican Congress. Typically, a Republican Congress has been more pro-free trade. They'll let Trump do what he wants to do, but I think over time you'll find a more rigorous view on these things than is the case if that would be the case otherwise. Imports of manufacturers from China still is not relevant to Australia. Imports of manufacturers from Mexico, all the components, is not relevant to Australia. And I've been through the other points about the TPP in this context. Leave WTO if necessary is simply not logical. So I'm going to leave my remarks at that point. I think there are some broad things to discuss here. The TPP is really important in the long run. Oddly enough, it gives better gains for agriculture. It enables us to try and get the gains out of the markets we couldn't get out of WTO. But in the long run, the real reality of the TPP is it's a modern trade agreement where, in the long run, as I mentioned before, tariffs on goods are low, except in agriculture. Growth in the future on global economies depends now on investment and on services. And they're the two areas where, if you look at our performances in the last 10 years, I looked up in 2004, our two-way trade with the United States was smaller than two-way investment. And because of the history of investment in our economy, that's now extremely important. In the last 4 or 5 years, well, since the global financial crisis, there's been a shift in the way in which what the more important indicators of global growth are. At one point, we used to look at trade. We thought if trade was rising, then there would be growth afterwards. That stopped with the global financial crisis. But what we're now seeing is expansion in rates of investment. If you think about it from a trade standpoint, if you're in business, the market in the other country is open, it should be a business choice to decide whether you'll export to it or invest in it. That's where we've got to, I think, in today's world.